Good morning and welcome to this video reflection from West Worthing Baptist Church on Sunday the 23rd of August. Back in early February, during the early part of this year when we weren't anticipating anything worse than the weather keeping us confined, I took my phone out of my pocket and stood on the seafront, taking a video shot of a number of gulls bobbing about on the swelling sea. Where are they now, these indistinguishable seabirds who were so at home on the grey waves of winter? How many winter storms have they weathered? Are their young gathering on the stony beaches and picking around at the bins of recently reopened food outlets? As I brought up the news screen to read the paper on Friday morning, I looked into the eyes of a young man who had turned to look towards the camera. Thumb on chin, he was striking a thoughtful pose. Behind him was an open laptop. I would have liked to have met him. Perhaps he was taking a selfie to send to one of his brothers or friends. I won't ever know, and neither will you. He lost his life attempting to cross the Strait of Dover, using an inflatable dinghy with shovels for oars. He was not made for crossing these inhospitable waters in such a way. There's more than one psalm from the Old Testament which describes the most fearful and fearsome times by means of depth of water and stormy seas, and ourselves, like birds, released after almost being crushed in a snare. In many, there is still a palpable sense of threat, which is still within touching distance, which really is still there. We can still feel the fear, the horror, which is not removed by the faith which the psalmist expresses at the song's beginning and ending. He's too close to the event to break into easy celebration. Destruction is still snapping at his heels. Life is fragile and easily snatched away. From Psalm 124. If it had not been for the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side when our enemies attacked us, then they would have swallowed us up alive when their anger was kindled against us. Then the flood would have swept us away, the torrent would have gone over us, then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. If God hadn't been on our side. During this last couple of weeks, we've been looking at parts of the story of Joseph. Joseph, who was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery, who ended up in Egypt, where his life journey wound from privileged favourite to favoured slave, through being lusted after by Pharaoh's wife to imprisonment as a result of her rage when he won't respond, through his dreamer's gifts of reading dreams to a trusted position of administering material resources, whose adult life was spent exiled from the few who had always wished him well until the whole family was reunited through his response to his treacherous brothers who arrive in Egypt seeking food in time of famine. We've been reminded of the strange ways of God who works out all things for good. And we ask ourselves whether we have the courage to live with this uneasy truth. I've recently been listening to the audio version of a book shaped from lectures given by the Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. He gave them in the spring of 1946, a bare 9 months or so after the end of the Second World War, during which, along with many of his Jewish compatriots, he had suffered almost to death in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. Some, the many, did not survive. The title of the lectures, Yes to Life in Spite of Everything, is taken from a song which was sung by some prisoners, which in itself was an act of defiance and hope in terrible circumstances. Frankl's parents and his pregnant wife all perished in the Holocaust. The liberation which came to him and other survivors could not bring them back or undo the deprivations and horrors. But he hung on to the conviction that a sense of meaning is one of the most important and significant things in life. He had sewn the pages of a manuscript about this into the lining of his overcoat before his arrest. He lost that, of course, along with the coat on his first day as a prisoner, but he cherished the thoughts which had taken root in his soul and the human freedom to inwardly engage in preparing the lecture that he would give one day. People need a purpose. We need a purpose. This is what Frankl later wrote. One day, a young man sat in front of me who had just confronted me about the question of the meaning or meaninglessness of life. His argument was as follows. It's easy for you to talk. You've set up counselling centres. You help people. You straighten people out. But I? Who am I? What am I? A tailor's assistant. What can I do? How can I give my life meaning through my actions? This man had forgotten that it is never a question of where someone is in life or which profession he's in. It is only a matter of how he occupies his circle in life and fills his place. Whether a life is fulfilled doesn't depend on how great one's radius of action is, but rather only on whether the circle is fully filled out. In his specific environment, this tailor's assistant can achieve more, and in the things he does and the things he leaves undone, he can lead a more meaningful life than the person he envies, if that person is not aware of his greater responsibility in life and does not do justice to it. That was Frankl writing in Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. And we're going to hear some verses from Matthew chapter 5. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light for the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. If we hold these verses from the Gospel alongside that recollection of a wise and courageous concentration camp survivor, we might remember that, like Frankl in his encounter with that tailor's assistant, Jesus, as he travelled through the region of Galilee and beyond, was talking not to the conscious history makers, the powerful in the land, but to servants and labourers, helpers and hinderers. Listen now to another story. this time from the book of Exodus, from the 8th verse of chapter 1 through to verse 10 of chapter 2. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labour. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and every kind of field labour. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to look after the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Ignorance of things before always brings consequences for things afterwards. Rarely is the beginning of a story found which encapsulates so much tragedy and so much hope. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. How could this Pharaoh know Joseph? He probably didn't even know about him. The tales that had been told about a slave who had made his way up to the highest administrative role in the land, the benefits that had come to the people because of him, the suffering they had been spared because of his clever conserving of resources. It was all a very long time ago. Perhaps if they hadn't been so welcoming to his wretched family, it would have been different. One foreigner on their own, or perhaps just a few, can be an asset. But now there were tribes of them, and they were threatening to outnumber the originals. In short, they were becoming more of a threat to the present than a memory of past salvation. What the birds of the air seem to receive without teaching and without learning is not so given to the sons and daughters of men. The gulls swoop about on the stormy currents, and their young bob about on the grey seas from generation to generation. They don't seem to suffer from amnesia in the same way. We are prone to forgetfulness, and one generation is rarely far-sighted enough to take notice of another. But in our humanity, we are also gifted with the capacity to respond to the consequences which this brings within our horizon. Whether a life is fulfilled does not depend on how great one's radius of action is, but rather only on whether the circle is fully filled out. The midwives, who will scarcely be heard of again in sacred story, fill out their circle fully by investing every last scrap of their personal safety towards the safety of the children under threat. They failed, of course. Who could outwit the machinery of state beyond the first few giddy successes? But who knows how many they inspired with their risky episode of civil disobedience? At any rate, for a while, the threat of the powerful was countered by those whose power was of a different order. The power to save life and bring hope safely to birth. These wonderful women were filling out the circle of their lives with their indefatigable wit and spirit, and refusing to take rulings from the state which went against their calling and their conscience. Until Pharaoh starts aping clever ways but combines them with wickedness. If he couldn't stop the births, he would have the male children killed. Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. That will sort it. Girl children don't matter. They're okay for slaves, and they won't be able to have Hebrew children if there are no males. Until one boy's mother hides him in the very place which Pharaoh has decreed for his drowning, and fills out the small circle of her life. And his sister keeps watch and speaks out at the right time to the Pharaoh's daughter who has found him. Each of these disregards the question of where they are in life, their role, their status. You know, it's easy to reflect on the comparative lowliness of the mother and the sister, but we shouldn't forget that the Egyptian princess was acting without regard for her role as representative of her father, who decreed the death of all these boys. The action of each within this finite, small world of the riverbank fundamentally changes the amnesia of those who will not learn from the stories which are shaping the world. As we might expect, A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, who did not know that the pattern of his own safety and prosperity was drawn by one who was outside. As we might expect, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And we're drawn again into the tragedy of history and the hope of God's presence within it. Because of those who lived fully in the moment, however limited their wider scope for action, a baby was born. A baby was saved who will save his people. We shouldn't find it surprising that amongst those who first found purpose in following Jesus, there was a wordsmith who fashioned a gospel which told about a baby born to an unknown girl who shared her name with Moses' sister. A baby whose parents found respite with him in the land of Egypt when a contemporary paranoid ruler set out to murder the baby boys. A child who would grow to lead people out of their slavery to their fears and teach them God's new command of self-giving love. The Gospel according to Matthew invites us to be shaped by the patterns redrawn by Jesus, who doesn't go around telling people that life owes them anything, but tells his friends that they are salt and light for the world. Every present moment touched by a future goal. If not now, when? If not me, who? Lord, save us from forgetting the stories which still speak into our present and give shape to your future. Stories in which you do not always feature by name, but which are filled with your hidden presence in people who are your promise, even working life when death intends to rule. Draw us in among them, into the company of the midwives who kept faith with their calling at the cost of enraging their employer, into the company of Moses' mother and sister Miriam, who hid the child destined for death, into the company of the sharp-eyed daughter of the Egyptian king, who set sight on political reality but lost his vision for compassionate justice. Draw us closer into the company of Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, in whose parables we hear about your hidden presence, in whose life we meet you as God among us, fully in each moment, in whose dying and rising you face us with your unstoppable love. Amen.